Why does a man ask you to marry him and then spend 2 years finding reasons not to actually do it? I'm Solveig, 34, and I've worked as a family law paralegal for 11 years, which means I've read hundreds of divorce petitions, custody filings, and court dockets for other people's marriages falling apart, a skill that turned out to matter a great deal more than I ever expected. The week I finally understood why my own wedding kept getting postponed. By the time I found the real answer, we'd lost close to $18,000 in non-refundable deposits across 2 canceled dates, and a third one was already circled on the calendar, closing in fast. I want to walk you through exactly how I found out, because it didn't happen all at once. It happened in pieces over about 3 weeks, each one changing what I thought the last one meant. Desmond and I met at a mutual friend's dinner party 6 years ago. He's warm in a way that draws people toward him without trying, the kind of person who remembers a stranger's dog's name after meeting them once. He runs a small commercial insurance brokerage his father started, does well enough, drives a car older than it needs to be because he genuinely doesn't care about appearances. I fell for him slowly, the unglamorous way, over years of ordinary Tuesdays grocery runs, arguing about which route was faster to my mother's house. The kind of small domestic rhythm that never made for a good story, but felt at the time like exactly what I wanted the rest of my life to sound like. I remember the first time I met his father, Wendell, at the brokerage office on a Saturday, boxes of old files stacked against one wall, and how Wendell had looked at me for a long moment before saying to Desmond, not me, that I looked like someone who'd actually keep him honest. I laughed it off at the time. Desmond laughed too, a little too quickly, and steered us toward lunch before I could ask what exactly he meant by it. I think about that comment differently now, and about how fast the subject got changed. I should tell you something about the work I do because it's going to matter more than you'd expect. A few months before any of this started, I was helping a senior attorney at my firm untangle a case where a husband had quietly kept a decade-old divorce filing open, technically active, but never finalized for reasons that only came out once his second wife's attorney started asking pointed questions about a pension. I remember sitting in a conference room listening to that story unfold and thinking almost smugly that I couldn't imagine not noticing something like that in my own life. I think about that thought a lot now, too. He proposed 2 years ago on a hike we'd done a dozen times before. No elaborate setup, just him getting quiet halfway up the trail and asking plainly if I'd spend the rest of my life with him. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We sat on a flat rock at the top for almost an hour afterward, not saying much, just watching the valley below. And I remember thinking that was the version of a proposal I actually wanted. No crowd. No orchestrated surprise, just the truth of it. Quiet and certain. The first wedding date 18 months ago got postponed 6 weeks out. He said his father's health had taken a turn, which was true. Wendell genuinely was in the hospital that month for a cardiac scare, and postponing felt not just reasonable, but obviously right. We lost the deposit on the venue, about $6,000, and I didn't think twice about it. You don't get married while your father-in-law is in a cardiac unit. I sat in that hospital waiting room with Desmond for 2 straight days, holding his hand, and if anything, that stretch of time made me feel closer to him, not further away. The second date set for last spring got postponed 9 weeks out this time over what Desmond called a complicated situation with his business insurance licensing that needed resolving first. I asked for details. He gave me a version vague enough that I didn't push, because I trusted him, and because pushing felt like doubting him over something that sounded on its face like ordinary paperwork trouble. We lost another chunk of deposits, closer to $12,000 this time, split across a caterer and a photographer who'd both blocked the date exclusively for us. I remember calling the photographer myself to apologize, feeling embarrassed on Desmond's behalf, telling her it was just bad timing. Business complications, nothing serious. She was kind about it. I remember thinking, driving home from that call, how strange it was to be apologizing for someone else's timeline as if it were my own. Here's the thing about doing the kind of work I do. I read postponed hearings and delayed filings constantly. I know professionally that a genuine one-time delay, looks completely different from a delay that's actually a pattern someone hasn't admitted to themselves yet. I just hadn't let myself apply that knowledge to my own life until the third date started slipping too. Around that time, one of the attorneys I work under, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priscilla, asked me twice in 1 week if I was feeling all right, because I'd misfiled something small I never misfile, and had gone quiet during a meeting where I'd normally have had 3 follow-up questions ready. I told her I was just tired from wedding planning, which felt true enough at the time not to count as a lie. She didn't push, just told me to take an actual lunch break instead of eating a granola bar at my desk again. And I remember being grateful she hadn't asked a second time, because I don't think I could have kept the answer that simple much longer. Stick with me here, because the next part is what actually cracked this whole thing open, and it started with something so small I almost didn't register it. We'd set a third date this past January, quieter this time, smaller. No big deposits at risk, beyond a modest venue hold. 6 weeks before it, Desmond got a call during dinner and stepped outside to take it, which wasn't unusual, except when he came back in. He was pale in a way I hadn't seen before, and he said almost too quickly that it was just his attorney about the business license thing. Again, nothing new. I asked which attorney. He said a name I didn't recognize, then quickly added it was a new one his father's old lawyer had referred him to, and changed the subject to what we should make for dinner the following night. I let it go. I noticed myself letting it go, which in hindsight was its own kind of warning. 2 days later, sorting through a stack of mail we'd let pile up on the kitchen counter, I found an envelope from a courthouse 2 counties over addressed to Desmond, unopened. I want to be honest that I hesitated before opening it. I stood there holding it for what felt like 10 minutes, weighing the version of myself who trusted him completely against the version who'd spent 11 years reading exactly this kind of envelope for other people's falling-apart marriages. I decided in the end that 18 months of postponed weddings had earned me the right to at least read an envelope with his name on it. It was a scheduling notice, a case number, a hearing date. The case type listed in the kind of shorthand I read for a living was a dissolution of marriage. I sat at that counter for a long time before I moved. I told myself there had to be an explanation that made sense: a mistake, an old file that hadn't been closed out properly, something administrative. I've seen enough real ones to know how often that's actually true. So instead of confronting him with an assumption, I did what I actually know how to do. I ran the case number through the county's public docket system the next morning on my own time before work, coffee going cold beside me while I clicked through pages I could normally read in my sleep and somehow could barely focus on. The case had been open for over 3 years, filed a full year before Desmond and I had even met. That answered nothing and opened up everything. If a divorce petition had been sitting open for 3 years, either it was moving glacially through an overloaded court system, which happens more than people think, or somebody involved in it had a reason not to want it finished. I need to pause here because I know some of you have had that exact moment, the one where a single document changes what an entire relationship looks like in hindsight. If you've been there, I see you. And what I found out over the next 2 weeks made that first document look almost gentle by comparison. I told my sister Junia that same night, sitting on her back porch with 2 glasses of wine, neither of us finished. I hadn't planned to say anything to anyone yet, but I couldn't hold it alone. She didn't tell me what to do. She just asked quietly if I wanted her to help me figure out what it meant, or if I needed to figure it out myself first. I told her I needed a little more time. She said okay, and that she'd be there whenever I was ready either way. She held my hand on the porch railing for a while after that, and neither of us said anything else about it that night. I couldn't access the full case file through the public system. Family law records get sealed past a certain point, which I know better than almost anyone given what I do for a living. But I could see enough of the docket entries to notice the pattern. Continuance after continuance. 6 of them over 3 years. Every single one filed by the same party. Desmond. Not his ex-wife. Him. Her name listed as the petitioner opposite him was Marguerite. A name I'd never once heard him say. I didn't confront him yet. I called Azine instead, a court clerk I'd worked with professionally for almost a decade, someone I trusted completely, and asked her off the record if she could tell me anything about a pattern of that many continuances filed by one party in a dissolution case. She told me what I already suspected but hadn't wanted to say out loud yet, that many continuances all filed by one side usually means that side has a reason to keep the marriage technically active. Sometimes insurance, sometimes immigration status. Sometimes she said money tied up in something that requires an intact marriage to access. Azine asked me carefully if I wanted her to keep looking into anything else on her end, or if I'd rather handle the rest myself, given how personal it had become. I told her I needed to see this through on my own, at least the next part of it, but that I'd call her the second I needed help navigating something I couldn't access publicly. She said that was fair, and reminded me gently that whatever I found, it wasn't going to be my fault for having looked. I thought about his father's brokerage. I thought about how Desmond had once mentioned almost in passing a family trust his grandmother had set up decades ago, something he'd get access to eventually on terms he'd never fully explained. I'd never asked follow-up questions about it because it had never seemed relevant to anything. 2 nights later, I drove to the courthouse myself on my lunch break and requested the redacted portions of the file I was legally allowed to see as a member of the public, the same request I make routinely for clients. Except this time, my hands weren't steady filling out the form. I sat in the same public records room I'd sat in 100 times professionally, except this time I was the one whose life was inside the file. What I found: the trust his grandmother had set up specified that Desmond would gain full access to a significant portion of it, low 7 figures only if he remained legally married continuously for a period tied to a clause written decades ago, one his grandmother had apparently included to keep him from making in her words on the original document. Another impulsive decision, the way she'd felt his first marriage had been. He hadn't been unable to finalize his divorce. He'd been choosing not to for over 3 years because finalizing it would end his eligibility before the clause's window closed. And every wedding date he'd set with me had been quietly timed around a deadline he'd never told me existed, one that required him to stay married to Marguerite for a few more months before he could actually divorce her and marry me without losing the money. 3 postponed weddings, $18,000 gone, 2 years of my life. All of it orbiting a clause in a will I'd never heard mentioned once. I want you to sit with that for a second because it's the detail that still gets to me the most. It wasn't cold feet. It wasn't fear of commitment. It was a spreadsheet decision dressed up as love, timed around a trust document older than our relationship. I didn't say anything to him for 3 more days, the longest 3 days of the entire thing, because I needed to actually see the trust document itself before I said a word. The same instinct that had kept me quiet, through the mail, through the docket search, through everything. I've built a career on not accusing anyone of anything until the paperwork actually says it plainly. I found it eventually in a box in the garage. He thought I never went into a folder from an estate attorney. The actual trust language, the actual clause, his own handwriting in the margin from years ago. 3 more months, 6 weeks before what would have been our 3rd wedding. I remember sitting on the cold garage floor, reading that clause 3 separate times, waiting for it to say something different the 3rd time. It didn't. I put the folder back exactly where I'd found it, in the same order, the same angle against the box wall, and went back inside to make dinner like the last hour of my life hadn't just happened. That Thursday, Desmond came home to find me sitting at the kitchen table with the folder closed in front of me, the same table where he'd once gotten a call and come back in, pale, saying it was nothing. He asked what was wrong. I told him nothing was wrong anymore, actually, because I finally understood. I opened the folder and turned it toward him instead of sliding it, watching his face change in real time as he recognized exactly what I was holding. He didn't deny it. He said he'd meant to tell me from the beginning that the timeline had felt impossible to explain, without sounding calculating that somewhere along the way, postponing had started to feel easier than having the conversation that would make him sound like the version of himself he didn't want me to see. He said his grandmother had died believing his first marriage was the mistake of his life, and some part of him had never stopped trying to prove her wrong about him, even years after she was gone, even at the cost of lying to the person he actually wanted to marry. I asked him the question that actually mattered to me more than the money, more than the wasted deposits. I asked if he would have told me the real reason ever if I hadn't found that envelope on the counter. He didn't answer for a long time. When he finally did, he said he honestly didn't know, and that not knowing scared him more than anything else in the whole situation. I want to pause again here because I think some of you are waiting for the dramatic confrontation, the yelling, the thrown ring. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter and somehow worse. Just two people sitting at a table, one of them finally understanding exactly how long she'd been waiting for a wedding that had never really been the thing standing in the way. I noticed sitting there across from him that some small part of me had already started grieving the version of this conversation I'd imagined having someday, the one where whatever came out was small enough to survive. This wasn't that conversation. I remember thinking almost clinically the way I think about a case file that I was watching the exact moment a 6-year relationship changed shape permanently, and that no amount of explanation afterward was going to change it back. We talked for almost 3 hours that night, longer than we'd talked about anything in months, working back through every postponed date, every vague explanation matching each one against what I now knew about the trust's timeline. Some of it lined up exactly. Some of it, he admitted, had just been convenient cover for delays that had nothing to do with the trust at all, moments where postponing had simply become the easiest available option, a habit by then, not a calculation. At one point, I asked him directly about Marguerite, what she was like, why the marriage had ended in the first place. He said it had been over in every real sense for almost 4 years, that she'd moved across the country not long after they separated, and had no idea, as far as he knew, that he'd kept the filing technically open this whole time. I asked if he'd ever told her about the trust clause. He said no. I remember thinking that meant there were 2 women who'd been kept in the dark about the same document just for different reasons. The delayed part of this story came about 10 days later, after I'd already moved into my sister's guest room to think. Izini called me off the record again to tell me something she'd come across finalizing an unrelated filing. Desmond had listed the trust as collateral on a business loan application 8 months earlier, meaning the still married status wasn't just protecting an inheritance anymore. It had become financial leverage he was actively using in real time, while he kept telling me a wedding date was still coming. That was the piece that finally made the decision simple instead of complicated. I didn't press charges because there wasn't a crime here exactly. Misleading someone in a relationship isn't the same as breaking the law, whatever it might feel like standing on the other side of it. What I did do was tell him plainly that I wasn't interested in being engaged to someone whose timeline for marrying me had been quietly set by a document I'd never been shown. He didn't argue. I think some part of him had been waiting for someone to finally say it out loud for him. I moved my things out over the following 2 weekends. Izini helped me carry boxes down 2 flights of stairs one Saturday, and halfway through asked me gently if I was doing okay. I told her honestly that I didn't fully know yet, but that for the first time in over a year I wasn't waiting on anything. My sister Junia didn't say much through any of it, just showed up with coffee and boxes and let me talk when I wanted to, and sit in silence when I didn't, which is exactly what I needed more than advice. On the last trip down the stairs, she asked if I regretted looking through the mail that day. I told her no without having to think about it. I'd rather know exactly what shape my life is standing on, even when it's not the shape I thought. I still work family law cases every day. It's strange reading other people's divorce petitions, other people's custody timelines, other people's trust disputes, and knowing now in a way, I didn't before, exactly how ordinary it is for someone to let a legal document quietly decide the shape of someone else's life without ever asking permission first. I catch myself sometimes reading a stranger's continuance filing and wondering what quiet deadline is sitting underneath it that nobody in that relationship has said out loud yet. I still check the mail differently now, if I'm honest. I used to let it sit on the counter for days. I don't anymore. I go through it the same afternoon it arrives every single time, and I don't think that habit is going away anytime soon. Priscilla asked me a few weeks after I'd moved out if I wanted to talk about whatever had been going on with me back when I'd misfiled that document and gone quiet in the meeting. I told her the short version. mostly because I trusted her not to make it bigger than it needed to be at work. She listened, didn't say much, and then told me something I've held on to since that in 11 years of family law, the cases that actually surprise her aren't the dramatic ones. They're the quiet ones, the ones where somebody spent years being technically honest while missing the actual truth by a mile. I think about that more than I expected to. Wendell called me once a few weeks after I'd moved out awkward in a way I'd never heard from him before, saying only that he was sorry that he hadn't known how far it had gone either, though he admitted after a long pause that he'd suspected something wasn't fully resolved with the divorce for a while and had never asked his son directly about it. I thought back to that comment he'd made the first time we met about me keeping Desmond honest, and I understood it differently now. Less a compliment, more a quiet hope he'd never followed up on himself. I believed Wendell. I don't think I'm ready to talk to him again yet, but I believed him. I ran into Desmond once more about 2 months later, at a mutual friend's engagement party. Neither of us had realized the other was invited to. We talked for maybe 5 minutes, mostly logistics, whether the last of my things had made it back to me, whether he'd finalized the divorce yet. He said he had finally 6 weeks after I'd found the folder, once the trust window had simply become irrelevant to him. There was something almost sad about hearing that the deadline he'd spent 3 years quietly protecting had stopped mattering the moment there was nothing left to protect it for. I've thought a lot in the months since about the difference between someone lying to you and someone simply never getting around to telling you the truth. Desmond would probably still argue it was the second one. I've read enough case files by now to know it rarely matters which one it actually was not to the person left holding the mail. If any part of this hit close to home, if you've ever had someone's timeline quietly built around something they never told you existed, I see you genuinely. And if you liked watching someone use exactly the skill nobody expected her to turn on her own relationship, watch my latest video next. You will not see what she finds there coming either.